Hey, welcome to another Businessology lesson. In this lesson, we're going to talk about agency profitability, really just profitability of a company. In general, want to bring some clarity to this. So a lot of people want to talk about how do I become more profitable? And profitability is really just the result of a math equation. So let me explain what I mean. So revenue in and then expenses out. So those two things are the important things, revenue in and expenses out. The result, what's left over is either profitability or loss. So we help people try to understand if you want your profitability to be better, you got to move up the profit and loss statement, so to speak, right? Because the revenue is at the top of a P&L statement or a profit and loss statement. The revenue's at the top. The expenses are in the middle. Revenue minus expenses just leaves the end result of a math equation. So profitability is not really a thing we work on. We work on expenses. And in a services company, the expenses are the labor, right? The labor is half of it, roughly. So we're always working on team efficiency. Team that are efficient get more work done per person or per whatever capacity commitment they have. And so efficiency just drops out to the bottom line where more of the revenue drops out to the bottom line in profit. And then, of course, revenue, when we're talking about revenue in a services company, a lot of times we're talking about pricing. Are you getting your pricing right? And some people bill for services, some price for services. So there's a lot of discussion about that. Okay, so now that we know what really profitability is and the things we actually work on in our businesses, that revenue and expense, so that more can drop out to the profitability, we want to know, what do you do with that profitability? So we like to think of it in maybe three buckets. There is revenue that's covering what I call your now expenses, right? So revenue, let's say revenue perfectly covered your expenses, right? So you're at a break even. Your profit and your loss are zero, right? The end of the math equation is zero. Revenue equals expenses. That's a situation where all of your revenue is covering all of your now expenses. That is the current expenses that hit your P&L this month that had to be paid. The revenue covered that. That's now expenses. So you want that to happen, right? You don't want to be in a loss. You don't want to have made a decision where your expenses are higher than your revenue, right? So that's one thing you want. Revenue can cover now expenses. You also want revenue to cover the second bucket, which is leftover profit, and that can be for distributions to the owners, right? So that's one of the benefits of being an owner. The risk you take not only produces the owner's salary, right? That's in the expense where the revenue covers the now expenses. One of those now expenses is a salary to the owner, so they're getting paid a wage. But if there's leftover profit, we pull distributions from profit. So that's where distributions come from. And distributions is a word you hear a lot if you're an S Corp owner, an S Corporation owner, you'll hear the word distribution. So owners take salary and they take distributions. You take distributions out of profit. So you have to have a leftover profit for the distribution. So that's more money for the owner, right? So the revenue, so those two buckets are revenue covers the now expenses, which includes salaries, owner salary. You want revenue to also be high enough to cover profit, which is where you can pull distributions. And then there's really a third category, and that is savings. You want the revenue to be so high, it covers the now expenses, the expenses on your P&L. It drops some to the bottom line, which is distributions. Then there's a third bucket where you want to save some of it. Now there's so much left over that you're taking distributions, but you can actually stick some in a savings account. And so we start to tell this third bucket, we start to tell business owners, agency owners, we want to see about 2 to 4 months worth of average operating expenses sitting in a savings account. That's a security thing. That's to help you with the risk of growth, is to have savings. So what savings is for investment. So what is an investment? An investment is money you spend now for the hope of some future return. If people hear me talk and teach a lot, you hear me say that a lot. And that makes sense, right? When we invest in the stock market, we're giving some of our money away now, and we hope it grows and produces, a higher profit in the future. We do that in business all the time. And so where do you make your investments from? It's from this third bucket, this savings bucket. So you got to be able to make enough profit to cover your expenses so that you might break even, to create profit that you pull distributions out of. If you want, you can leave that money in there if you want, but also savings for this investment. And what are investments? It might be that you see a new piece of software this is going to be an investment that's going to help your team become more efficient, because you use software to invest in the efficiency of a labor force, because efficiency in labor force produces more profit. That's what it's supposed to do. So the investment is to produce more efficiency in the team. Also, it might be time in your growth to go, we need a really strong expert. So we're going to go ahead and invest a salary in somebody who's really going to allow us to grow into the future. So this investment in this new person, right, is upfront money spent now on this big, large salary that you hope produces return later. It lets you sell more high-value services. It lets you as the owner step out of service, and this now new experienced person, this investment you make, they can now lead the team creatively to greater wins and greater value that you've been doing as the owner. And so you always make investments out of that. So how does debt play into this profit? Well, we're not ones that say no debt at all. Now, you do have to be careful with debt. Some clients do get into so much debt problems that their profit won't pay back that debt. Or they get into so much debt that they could never earn enough profit over the next 10 or 20 years to even pay the debt back. So that makes no sense. But a line of credit is a safe vehicle to use. And so especially when you're becoming a larger agency or you're working with more complex projects where you've got a higher upfront team, so there's labor. Sometimes you have to float through a line of credit, or if you start working with a Fortune 500 company or something like that, their AP processes are not going to pay you for 60, 90, 120 days sometimes, depending on the company. They dictate the money that they pay you and the timing of it. So you have to float a lot of those, and so a line of credit can be helpful. So debt is really a floating vehicle, right? So a line of credit can be a floating vehicle. And so the way I like to talk about it is, how do you know when you're floating is when there's this invoice payment you need to come in, and let's say it's $120,000. That has to come in, and it's going to come in about 5 or 6 days after you make payroll, right? But you need it to make payroll. So you'd get $120,000 from your line of credit. And then when that $120,000 comes in, it comes into the bank, you put that $120,000 from the line of credit back in the line of credit. So I like to match line of credit transfers up with invoice dollar amounts if I can. You can't always do that. And the reason I like to do that is I want to get a line of credit transfer identified with an invoice. If you don't, and you start just living on the line of credit, it just grows over time. What it's doing when it grows over time is funding your operations. What we've already talked about, that's bucket number one. Revenue is meant to cover your operations. It's meant to cover your expenses. So the debt is a floating vehicle. Now, how else does debt apply to this? Well, it applies to that third category, right? If you can save enough money, then you can use the savings to make your investments. But a lot of people use debt to make their investments. So for example, let's say they've run their business and maybe they're not running it very well, so it's barely producing profit, or they're in a season of a downturn. And of course, your business can struggle during that. So they don't have savings to make an investment. But they perceive that if I can just hire this person and I can pull out of the daily operations, I can really start growing the business. And they actually hire that high-value person and they use debt to make their payroll payments. That is an extremely high risk, because you have to turn around revenue to come in and start not only paying for that person's salary, that's the now expense in bucket one, you now have to send back that debt money. And so you have to really have a lot more revenue just to cover payroll and cover the payments on debt and get it paid back off. So that's just a way to think about debt when you're trying to cover profitability. All right, so there's the profitability conversation. Maybe that's one thing you haven't understood about your agency's P&L and profitability. Thanks for listening.